So welcome, everybody. Thank you. My name is Brad Olson, President of Wisconsin Farm Bureau, and welcome to the first of 4 Federal Milk Marketing Order educational series put on around the state. We're pleased to put this series on with UW economists, dairy economists Chuck Nicholson and Leonard Polzine. Also, a thank you to UW River Falls for having us today. So with that, welcome, Chuck and Leonard. We look forward to your presentations.
Great. Thank you very much, Brad. Pleasure to be here. So, as Brad mentioned, this is the first of 4 different educational programs that we will work together to provide actually over the next 8 days. And the first of these will focus on one of the things that I think has been a bigger issue and a source of a lot of discussion for folks considering the implications of this particular decision, and that is focusing on make allowances. So what I'd like to do is come over here for a second, say a little bit about the agenda that we have. And actually, to do that, it should be good to screen do what it's supposed to do. See if this will work now. The other advanced technology. Okay. So can I ask you to maybe give me a little bit of assistance with this? I mean, I've never had the issue before where the slides would not advance themselves. That is the part.
Not adding decision.
So actually, is that a sharing?
No, not stop sharing. This is a part show.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yes. So now it's here. Okay. I'm not sure exactly how that. But okay. Now we're good to go. So what I'd like to do is, I think it's helpful when we think about why we're doing this and what the potential implications are, to have a little bit of background about what it is that this whole thing called marketing orders is about and what they're supposed to do. Provide a little bit of an overview of the broad set of those changes that includes the changes to make allowances that we'll focus on this afternoon. Think a little bit about why we're doing this, why we're doing this to ourselves, and then think a little bit about how milk is priced, and that's going to lead us into a more direct discussion of the implications of these make allowance changes as one component of this recommended decision. And we want to try and allow a little bit of time for group discussion. That might take place online in this case. We can also have some discussion here in this room. And then we'll follow up and end this with some additional information about the next steps in this process, where we're going from here, including the important producer referendum, which is where producers will have the opportunity to weigh in on the proposed changes. Also, I imagine we'll have some time at the end for Q&A in person or online, so we'd be happy to have that be a part of what we have planned. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Leonard, who's going to walk us through the first part of this, including
Perfect, thank you. So first thing we'll do is, if you can all take out your phones quick, and scan this QR code up here. So we're just going to gather some initial information on you as the participants, really anonymous, but where you're at in your comfort, understanding, knowledge of federal marketing orders, and then also what's important to you in this topic. So I'll give you a moment to do that here before we continue on. I do want to note that as you get to, I think it's the 3rd question, it will have you rank which topics are of the most importance or interest to you. You do have to actually drag and drop those to rank them. Perfect. So it looks like folks are wrapping that up. Feel free to do so. Take your time as necessary. What I'm gonna kind of do is, as Chuck mentioned here, just kind of set the backdrop. We're gonna walk through a couple of those agenda items here before we get into some of the exact detail on the proposal. The reason for that is just to create this baseline understanding of where we're at, so we can figure out where we came from and where we're going, right? So the objective of federal milk marketing orders, and this is established in the 1937 Agricultural Agreement Adjustment Act. So they call it the Act, right? So the Act is the piece of legislation that we are working in and around, right? If it's not in the Act, if it's not in that piece of legislation, we are not then able to address it through the federal milk marketing order hearing process, right? So the purpose of that initial legislation is to promote orderly marketing conditions in fluid milk markets. Also, part of that is to improve the income situation of dairy farmers. Part of that originally was done through the pooling process. So when this originally happened, the idea of it was to kind of prevent a lot of people, a lot of farmers fighting over that one higher value fluid space, right? So that's what part of the pooling process did, is it gave more access to these higher value or different value markets than what just the local market was, right? So that's why kind of what brought forth some of these legislative changes and policy implementation that we still have and are looking at here today. So milk marketing orders also supervise the terms of trade in milk markets to achieve more equality of bargaining power between producers and processors. And finally, they assure consumers of adequate supplies of quality milk at reasonable prices. So when we take a look at federal milk marketing orders, a lot of people, when they think of their functions or activities, some of the ones that come to mind most often are things like classified pricing, pooling, things like this, right? But we're going to go through all of their functions. So that way, as we get to the end of our time together today, we'll take a look at what that referendum looks like. And it's important to keep in mind that when that referendum takes place, what we're voting for and what we're voting not for. And a lot of that circles back to what some of these orders functions are. So we have classified pricing and pooling. The federal orders also collect a lot of dairy commodity prices and information. They determine the handler prices based on end products, establish minimum uniform prices across pools. They also do weights and measures and component and volume audits. They make sure or ensure timely payments to producers, and they also create a lot of market information. Other functions that some folks maybe don't think about or don't come to mind as readily, but are no less important, are export certification services, dairy standards and product grading. They administer the fluid milk processor promotion and the dairy research and promotion programs. And they've also done the pandemic market volatility assistance program, milk donation reimbursement program, et cetera. I've often kind of heard the term that federal orders kind of act as a traffic cop within this entire system, right? So I've heard some in the legal world say that a rule without teeth is just a suggestion, right? Federal milk marketing orders become that not only administrative, but they have that administrative power or authority to add teeth when it comes to some of these functions, right? So at the moment, if we didn't have these, there would be no other, let's say teeth to some of the rules and regulations that are set forth by this legislation. Here's a map of all 11 milk marketing orders across the US. It is important to note that not all milk is priced based on federal milk marketing orders, as not all farm milk is sold in marketing areas. So milk buyers, other than milk buyers of class 1 milk in regulated areas, can choose not to be regulated. We're just going to run through some of the key elements of what the recommended decision is. This is not the final. The final will be coming out, but this kind of is the base framework of what is more than likely going to be in that final decision. So the recommended decision is that we're going to change standard milk composition. So protein would be 3.3% up from 3.1%. Other solids will be up to 6%, which is up from 5.9%. Non-fat solids, 9.3, up from 9.0. The removal of barrels from the class 3 pricing, that's cheese barrels. And one that we'll dive into a bit more here today is increased make allowance for cheese, butter, NDM, and dry whey. And these are used in class 3 and class 4 pricing. There'll be a 5 to 7 cents per pound increase. Increased butterfat retention factor in cheese. Also a reversion to the higher of advanced class 3 or class 4 skim milk price for that class 1 skim price. There's a new provision to adjust the class 1 price for ESL milk. Increase class 1 differentials. So increase in Wisconsin of about $1.20 per hundredweight, retain $1.60 per hundredweight minimum differential value. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Chuck. We'll kind of get into some of the meat and potatoes of what some of these details are in the recommended decision.
I think you mean the potatoes and cheese. Okay, so why are we doing this? Well, a lot of this has to do with the topic that's our focal point for today, make allowances. Make allowances were viewed as being a key issue, and this is an issue for both the dairy manufacturers, the buyers in North make cheese, but also for dairy producer representing organizations, including co-ops and National Milk Producers Federation. So some of the symptoms that we saw that there was an issue with make allowances where we saw depooling. I'll show you in a minute. I think that's maybe even a little bit more chronic kind of problem, which is less pooling here in the upper Midwest. Declines in producer premiums. We saw cooperatives reblending actually to be able to pay lower than the minimum regulated class prices. And in certain situations, the negative producer price differentials were also kind of a symptom that there was an issue. So let me show you a little bit of what I mean by the storyline for these different symptoms of this particular problem. So this graph is a little bit busy, but what it's showing you is, on the one hand, a manufacturing cost index that's put out by the Bureau of the Census for cheese. That is the blue line. This goes back to January 2016, and you can see over that time period, it's bounced around a little bit, but particularly we got into the early 20s, even in the post-COVID period. And that price index, the cost index had increased quite a lot. And this was actually part of the motivating factor for organizations like the International Dairy Foods Association and the Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association to say our costs have risen quite a lot. We need to actually make some adjustments that are reflected in appropriate values for these make allowances. At the same time, the orange line is actually showing us an approximation of what average overorder premiums, price premiums above the minimum regulated prices, would have been here in order 30. You can see there that those two things are kind of basically moving in opposite directions. The cost increases apparently were having the impact of providing some squeeze on the buyers of milk for cheese, and some of that squeeze at least was getting reflected in lower overorder premiums over time. And this is a little bit of an incomplete series because Marketing Order 30 stopped publishing the information that's necessary to do this back in 2021. We can actually look at a place like the state of New York, where they also report this data collected by the state Department of Ag and Markets. And there's a very similar pattern that carries through to today, reductions in overorder premiums, even in that particular market. Okay, so these were symptoms that something was kind of not working the way we wanted it to work. I mentioned also that depooling was an issue. This is a proportion of milk produced in Minnesota and Wisconsin that was pooled on order 30 going back now to the beginning of 2015. The depooling issue is shown by all the ups and downs, the big spikes and the big troughs there. And there's also a black line that's actually showing that we're producing more milk in this part of the world, but about the same amount of milk all the time is being pooled on order 30. Which means that the proportion of milk being produced is also decreasing over time. So we know, we'll talk more about it in a minute, there are incentives to people who make cheese to pool milk when the conditions are economically appropriate for them to do that. And this is sort of suggesting that the conditions have become less favorable over time, which is part of the reason that we're seeing that decline in trend in the overall amount of milk that is being pooled. Okay, so all of these things seem to be part of a symptom of an issue that we're trying to address by having this process, proposing some changes, and then probably carrying through to the finalization of those changes. So we're here to talk about make allowances, and I think to talk about make allowances, we actually need to understand a little bit more of the general picture on how we price milk under federal milk marketing orders. So what we're trying to do is figure out what would be under our current system an appropriate minimum regulated price for milk that we're going to pay the farmers based on the use of that milk, right? I'm showing you here where most of the milk by far in Wisconsin goes sort of into cheese and whey production. And what we want to do is figure out that price that should be the minimum for farm milk based on the key products for cheese making, which in this case are primarily cheese and dried whey, but could also include butter. So we're trying to figure out if we have prices for those products, cheese, dry whey, and butter, how do we relate those prices to the price of farm milk? So we start with looking at product prices, and then we use that to come up with a minimum regulated value for the farm milk, right? So we start with the product prices. I'm going to show you these three particular ones here: the butter, the cheddar cheese price, and the dry whey price. Those are monthly market prices published by USDA, and we use those to calculate component values for butter fat, for protein, and for other solids. And the basic idea is once we know the component values, we can look at the components in milk, and that adds up to be the minimum price for farm milk used in cheese. So the value of all the components is going to be equal to the value of the milk, right? So one of the key things in this whole situation is how do we start with those product prices and come up with the component values? Well, here's an example, and this is actually, believe it or not, the most simple of the examples we can look at, and it's actually how do we calculate the value of butter fat based on the butter price. So you can see if you're looking at a screen that shows it clearly enough, we got a butter price, that market price that USDA reports, shown in red, and we're going to subtract something that we call a make allowance, which is the focus of today's entire presentation, really. And then we make an adjustment for the yield factor because we can actually make more than 1 pound of butter from 1 pound of butter fat because the other parts of butter are water and salt, right? So this is where that make allowance becomes important because we're going to start with the product price and we subtract that make allowance to figure out what the value of that butter fat would be in farm milk. Okay. So we actually have a more complicated system than that because we're going to look at 4 different cheese commodities, including cheese, butter, whey, and non-fat dry milk. We're going to use those to calculate 4 different component values. And then, of course, the component values depend in part on the use that the milk was made, a product the milk was made into, and that's where we're talking about classes 1 through 4. Leonard had mentioned earlier, pooling is one of the provisions that was important for federal marketing orders. That's basically adding up the value of all those components across all the different uses, and then calculating what a minimum pay price would be to farms based on that overall set of different 4 classes. Okay, so if your eyes are already glazing over, I can understand that. But it's kind of important to understand where it is that we are with the way that our system currently works, okay? So with that as background, we've got increases in make allowances for products, butter, cheese, and dry whey that were key elements of the decision that are going to affect the class 3 milk price.
Would you want questions now or after?
Is the question that can benefit from clarification now? So maybe not.
Is market price the retail or wholesale price when we're talking about in-product pricing?
Great question. Is the price a retail price or wholesale price? In this case, it's wholesale price that the USDA is surveying for those different 4 products. Other questions or clarification?
That's in the chat.
Okay, great. So there were some other things that will be important. Leonard mentioned changing the standard composition of milk as being one of the key elements of this. The retention factors and the barrel versus block cheese were also elements of this. I'm going to focus on the first one because I think it really is the one that is the most impactful to Class 3 milk prices going forward. All right. So I said the make allowance is basically there to make an allowance for the fact that it's not free to take farm milk and turn it into different products that we're looking at. So USDA, when they had their hearings, had to figure out what would a good value be. Well, they had evidence that took a number of different forms. You can actually survey plants and find out what it costs them to take milk and turn it into cheese and dry whey. You can also sort of build an economic engineering study. You make some assumptions about what a plant configuration might look like, and you cost that all out, looking at current input prices in different parts of the country, and that will give you an estimate of what the cost will be. Another element that you can do is say we had some information from California through 2016, and we fast forwarded that with some statistical analyses to help us think about how input prices have changed over time. And that gives us another way to estimate what that actual cost to transform farm milk into cheese would be. USDA in the testimony they got heard all these different options. They had evidence that was provided by each one of these things. And that's what was used to help inform their decision about changing the make allowances themselves. So the other thing that's kind of important to remember is whenever you do a study, whether it's surveying plants or some other approach, you get a range of different possible cost values. And I'm just showing you ones here that are not necessarily related to the current costs, but they're trying to illustrate the idea that some costs will be low in some plants and other costs will be much higher in some other plants. So one of the things USDA has to do is not just think about one number, but think about the fact that there's a whole different range of manufacturing costs out there in cheese plants in the United States. And so they did that in the course of trying to figure out what this new set of make allowances would be. And so I'm going to show you a series of 3 different graphs, and they're illustrating kind of where USDA came down relative to where we are now, which is the current, always off there on the left, the recommendation by National Milk, who did in fact suggest that the make allowances should be increased. And then on the far right, there are 2 bars that are what the International Dairy Foods Association proposed. And the reason there are 2 of those is that they actually suggested a kind of graduated increase in the make allowances over time, right? So where did USDA come down? That's the green bar right in the center. And it's in the center both from left to right, but it's also in the center from up and down. So in each of the cases, USDA's recommendation for the make allowance change was bigger than what had been proposed by National Milk. Was bigger than the starting value that IDFA, and by the way, the Wisconsin cheesemakers were also aligned with this, bigger than their starting value, but lower than the maximum value. So USDA is kind of holding up the scales and trying to see where everything comes out. Perhaps not surprisingly, they came down kind of somewhere in the middle. Okay. So they're proposing on the cheese make allowance to increase it from about 20 cents to about 25 cents. So about 5 cents per pound of cheese would be the increase in that make allowance. We'll talk more in a minute about what that means in terms of farm milk prices. Similarly, this is their dry whey make allowance proposal. Again, the cost that they're assigning to take farm milk, really whey, and transform it into a dry whey product. Current value off here on the left, National Milk next to it there, IDFA out on the right-hand side, and again, right in the middle of the green bar is the recommended decision. So again, higher than what was requested by National Milk, lower than the ending values that IDFA had in mind. The dry whey was actually the recommended decision's biggest increase in the make allowances. You can see it's at about close to 7 cents. So Leonard mentioned 5 to 7 cents. The dry whey one was bigger. And finally, we look at the butterfat. The current value is about 17 cents USDA in the middle there, the green bar, recommended increasing it to about 22.57 cents. Again, it's a bigger increase than what National Milk had desired, a smaller increase than what IDFA had wanted at the end. Okay. So in each case, USDA, when they looked at the different evidence, they were thinking about that distribution of costs across cheese, whey, and butter, decided that somewhere in the middle was an appropriate way to put that make allowance value. Okay. All right, so if you thought your eyes were tired already, let me assure you that we're not going to go through this in a lot of detail. Yes, question over here.
So I have a question for you. When I look into these three charts, I see that there is a pattern, the way the prices are recommended. So like the IDF and they always propose higher compared to the national mean for all three cases. Why is that?
So the question is, why is the
Why there is
IDFA
a-
higher?
The IDFA always propose the most higher increase in all three cases compared to the other three.
Okay, so I'm going to try and give you an answer that's also political, politic in a sense, okay? So National Milk is representing dairy farmers, and they're clearly saying, we believe that some adjustments should be made and we'll make allowance for these products. The IDFA represents dairy processors. They were the ones who really initiated this process, and they are saying, man, we actually need a much bigger make allowance to be appropriate for our costs and our members, okay? So it's a little bit of a divide between the dairy producer organization and the dairy processor organization that we're seeing here, okay? And as I said, USDA perhaps surprisingly kind of came down somewhere in there. Okay, so let's go back to this. So if you look in the lower right corner over there, you can see we're talking about what the class 3 milk price would be, right? There's a bunch of steps. Don't worry about all the specifics of them right here. There's a bunch of steps that are getting you there. What I want to do is actually show you this and then say, okay, this is all the places when USDA suggested a change, that there would be changes in the pathway to getting to that class 3 milk price. The places where you see the red up here on the left-hand side, those are places where we're talking about a change to those make allowances. You're subtracting a bigger number from the price of the product. You're getting a smaller value for the different components, the butterfat, the protein, and the other solids. Over on the right-hand side, Leonard mentioned the change in the composition. The class 3 skim milk price is where that comes in. That went from 3.1 to 3.3 and 5.9 to 6.0 for protein and other solids. And then we get to the class 3 milk price. Okay. So just go back for a second here. There were a lot of places where what USDA did is going to make a difference to what that class 3 milk price looks like. And so that's kind of the key point with the visuals that I'm trying to get at here, not so much the details. All right. So let's actually think about what this would have meant for component values in a month like 2024. And I'm looking here at butterfat under the current and proposed, the protein under the current pricing that we have and the proposed, and the other solids under the current and proposed. And I've highlighted in red where the changes would be made and what the differences would be. You go to that far right column over there, basically what we're looking at is a bit over 6.5 cents reduction in the butterfat value as a result of changes in the make allowances. About a 10-cent reduction in the protein value as a result of these changes, and about a 7-cent reduction in the other solids. Okay. So here in the upper Midwest, producers are going to get paid on the basis of the components in the milk. And so this is likely to have a direct impact on the value of those components as it would be paid to producers in a month like September 2024. Right? So let's look at an example then. Again, I'm trying not to overwhelm your eyes too much with this. I mostly want you to focus on the fact that we kind of got 3 different ways we can view these price changes. We can look at the impact on a class 3 skim milk price. You don't want to look at all the ugly stuff in the middle, go all the way over to the right. And you can see that in September 24, we would have gone from 11.09 per hundredweight for that class 3 skim price to about 10.99. Difference is about 10 cents per hundredweight. If we go to the class 3 price, forget about all the stuff on the left if you don't want to look at it. Now we would go from about 23.34 per hundredweight to about 23.02, difference of about 32 cents per hundredweight. One of the things that's actually helping a little bit here is we've changed the composition that we're reporting that class 3 milk price at. Because the other way to view this is to look at those component values. And if we look at the component values, there's actually a much larger difference from about 26.31 per hundredweight to about 25.36 per hundredweight, or a difference of about 92 cents per hundredweight. Okay. So these are different ways in which you can think about the impacts of making these changes. And this is actually important kind of to note that this is for milk that is currently pooled. These would be the kinds of changes. If your milk is not being currently pooled, we don't really have a good idea about what you're being paid, except that it's probably going to be lower than the values that be reported here for particularly class 3 or for the components. And if the milk's not currently pooled or is being reblended, you may not actually see 32 cents or 92 cents. You could actually see an increase depending on where your milk is currently being priced. Okay. So that was kind of setting you up for something that's maybe a little bit easier to look at here. And it actually includes now both class 3 and class 4. When we look at the value of components only in class 3, you're looking at about a 92 cent per hundredweight reduction in a month like September 2024. If you add in that component change from 3.1 to 3.3 and 5.9 to 6.0, that actually makes that number look better, even though it's not going to be how producers will be paid. But we can do a similar kind of calculation for class 4, and we see a similar kind of pattern. The impact overall on component values in class 4 are lower, and we see that the composition of the milk also makes a difference there. Okay. So overall, then, what would we expect for the changes to what changes would take place as a result of this? Well, component pricing orders, like order 30 here in the upper Midwest. The component value of producer milk checks will be lower, especially in the short term. However, we should see a little bit of an offset in terms of PPDs being higher because of one of the other elements in the decision that affected class 1 differentials. We also are likely to see more milk being pooled, and we'll talk in a moment about some of the combined impact of the other changes. Okay. So multiple kinds of impacts that we might expect to see. The component values being lower certainly would not be an exciting prospect for a lot of farms. Some of that will be coming back a little bit through some higher PPDs and more pooling of milk. Okay. So one of the things that often is used as a way of figuring out what impacts would be, and this is actually what USDA did themselves when they reported back, is you say, yeah, we're going to look at the last 5 years. And we're going to say, what would have happened if we changed these pricing formulas? And I'm trying to encourage us to be a little bit cautious about that, because if we took $1 hundredweight away from dairy farmers for a significant period of time, there'd be some significant production adjustments that would frankly take place on farms, and there'd be some changes in the demand for farm milk going forward too. So stuff wouldn't play out the way that it played out in the past just by changing those numbers. So looking backward or looking at a representative month like September 2024 can be helpful. But what I'd like to do is to encourage us to have a little bit more of a forward-looking sort of view about the potential impacts. Okay. So what happens over time? Well, we just talked about the fact that if we increase those make allowances, the short-term impact is we get a lower farm milk price, at least for pooled milk. And that's kind of what we talked about in the examples and graphs that I showed you. On the other hand, lower farm milk price basically probably means we're going to see some adjustments on the milk production side. You might pull a little bit more aggressively, feed a little bit less aggressively. Also, there'll be increased demand for farm milk for cheese. So on one of those, we're probably going to see a little bit less milk being produced. On the other, we're going to be a little bit more milk being demanded. And that affects the milk supply demand balance, both here in the upper Midwest, but also throughout the country. That milk supply demand balance is probably going to put some pressure on to maybe bring back some of those premiums that I said had declined. And that's some kind of offsetting positive effect on the farm pay price. And in addition, we're likely to see more milk being pooled over time, and then also bring more of that milk back into the pool and have an offsetting positive effect on the farm pay price, right? So there will be a dynamic for this decision that's going to play out actually over the next number of years. And so this is how I would view what we're likely to see here going forward. Okay. So with that in mind, let me show you a little bit about what we have some projections for the next, well, starting in 2024 through the end of 2028, the next 5 years. And overall, this is actually for milk, again, that is currently pooled. And it actually comes from some economic modeling work that we've done to try and assess the impacts of this recommended decision over the next 5 years. Okay? So I've got those years on the middle of the scale there. And what I want to show you is how on an annual basis, we're likely to see some differences in class 3, class 4 prices, as well as the class 3 components and the class 4 components. Okay? So as we project this forward, we actually see on the class 3 price a pattern where we actually start out with not too large an increase in a year like 2024. We reach kind of a bigger impact in 2027, and then we start to see some recovery in 2028. And that's the class 3 price that actually includes the change to the composition of the milk. Similarly, we can look at class 4, and we actually see a little bit different pattern for that. And you may be saying, why am I showing you some bars that say the price is going to be higher in a year like 2027 or 2028? And the fact is, that's part of the milk supply response that I mentioned earlier. Class 4 tends to be one of the places where we see that tightening of the milk supply-demand balance showing up in prices more readily. If we look at this on a component basis, somewhat similar storyline, but a little bit different kind of trajectory. This is actually the class 3 components without accounting for that change in the composition of the milk. And this is more how farmers in this part of the world would get paid for the components in their milk. You can see actually the largest negative impacts are early on, and then we get better over time with that milk supply response taking place and the increased demand for farm milk. And we actually see a kind of a pattern, again, that's a little bit different, but mirrors the class 4 components values there, right? So what we're likely to see then is some adjustments that will take place over time. Here we're showing the next 5 years. And so things will probably be harder in the first couple of years, and then will improve over time as we see that increased milk demand and response on the milk supply side. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up this part by giving kind of an overall perspective on this change to the make allowances. And that looks like this. I think there was a consensus among a lot of dairy industry organizations that the make allowances needed to be changed. They had not been updated since the year 2008, and a lot has changed in the dairy world, in the manufacturing costs since that time. The discussion that we're having right now is about just how much those make allowances really needed to be changed. And I showed you earlier, the dairy producer organization perspective on that was that they needed to be changed less than what USDA recommended. From the dairy processor perspective was that they needed to be changed a bit more. So as I mentioned, the impacts are going to play out over time. We can't look at just 1 year. And it's a little bit helpful to look back, but we should be a little cautious about thinking about that as being the best indicator. The changes in the formulas are going to affect milk supply and demand over time. My prediction is, in our economic modeling work, suggests that we're going to see the return of at least some modest premiums as a result of this. And again, the milk supplies are going to adjust to the price reductions, particularly in the next couple of years. Okay. All right, so with that, any other questions come in online? I must have put people to sleep with class 3 pricing formulas. But I'm going to hand over to Larry to talk about the exciting stuff about next steps.
So all of the grayed out lines there are the steps that we've already went through. And then the dark ones here are what's coming up next. So the USDA issued the recommended decision in July. And then parties filed their comments and exceptions. And then USDA takes those, goes through them, see if there's any tweaks, adjustments, additional considerations. Right, and then this is where we're at the moment, and what we're kind of looking forward to is for USDA to issue their final decision approximately mid-November. So once that final decision comes out, that's when the USDA holds their producer referendum in each order. So the voting process, right? So again, mid-November, final decision comes out. From that final decision, we'll receive the information and details of what that referendum formally looks like and what timelines are for each specific step going forward. So the USDA will, after the voting or the producer referendum process, the implementation of that amendment will then take place somewhere in early 2000 or early 2025. So what does this producer referendum look like? So dairy farmers will have the opportunity to vote on whether to adapt the order with the changes in the final decision or terminate the order, which means no more federal milk marketing order pricing. I'm going to say that just one more time. When the referendum comes out, the producers are voting on whether to adapt the changes from the final decision or terminate the orders. So maintaining the current provisions of what the order is not an option, right? So we're as proposed or not at all. And then voting is by order. So we'll go through what the qualifications are for voting, but it's by order. So each individual order, the producers that are eligible for the vote in that order are voting on that order, not for the entire order system. So big question here, as we talked about at the top, and we talked about how federal orders kind of act as that traffic cop for the whole system. So keep that in mind here. The big question is, are we better off with the order or without it? So not whether we like these changes or we don't like the proposed changes. So voting the order out would eliminate the beneficial aspects of the order that are not directly related to milk pricing, including auditing, testing, market information, kind of that list that we shared at the top of the presentation here. So unless these functions would be replaced with a different appropriate legislation. So not to be confused, there is no additional legislation that's in the works at the moment that would replace these, right? So right now, you're voting if it would be better with or without orders. It would likely result in farm milk pricing approximating that class 3 price. This is based on the experience in the Western order, which was terminated in 2004, and opportunities to pool milk on other orders would be limited. It would also eliminate payment of the PPD, which averaged about 29 cents from January 2022 to date. So with that, sorry, I thought there was another line there. My apologies. I think it might be a good time for us just to have some discussion questions, whether we want to do that collectively as a group or if folks want to sit next to each other. I'll leave that up to you guys. But I think the first question here we'll talk about is what would these proposed changes affect your farm or business? How would these changes affect your farm or business? Over here.
Chat start. Do that. Take over the mic if you want to bring in the board stuff.
So I'll bring forth one question here and then you respond and then we'll get into discussion. Will the make allowance outpace inflation to make the positive returns in in 3 to 5 years?
So the current proposed change is to set it and forget it on the allowances. So we made one change, only early in 2025. And then we don't make changes to that in the future. Actually, when I showed you the graphs that had IDFA's proposals, they actually wanted to make those things increase over time. There was also discussion about having a process to collect information, particularly through a manufacturing survey, either every year or every other year that would be used to update the make allowances. So we didn't wait 15 years again for the next time that it happened. Turns out my understanding is that USDA, the dairy division, does not have the legal authority to say we're going to mandate that we do a survey. However, Congress could, in the Farm Bill, decide that that would be an appropriate strategy to address future increases or future changes in the costs that are associated with those make allowances. So in the results that I showed that had the prices playing out over time, That's assuming a one-time change in the make allowance. No change to kind of trying to account for inflation. Not a part of what. And that change in prices over time is due entirely to for farm milk and for the demand for milk producers.
So thoughts,
In a nutshell, I mean, I saw the dairy producers, the bar and the bar. Are dairy producers likely to end up with less money in their pocket or more? I mean, and I gather that it's less maybe for the first 2 years and more for the subsequent 3, but
Yeah, so my assessment in our economic analysis would be that for milk that is currently being pooled, those component values are going down, and you're gonna see lower producer pay prices.
it used to, and I'm sorry, 'cause I'm not a dairy farmer. Pool would be co-op operation, or we have multiple farms going into the same processing, so there's no differentiation between your milk, my milk, kid milk.
Yeah, that'd be actually kind of a more traditional definition of pooling. Here we're talking about is the pool of dollars that is generated by the regulation under the federal milk marketing ordinance. So like the value of class 1 milk, the value of class 2 milk, the value of class 3 milk, the value of class 4 milk, almost all class 3 here in the upper Midwest. Add up all those values, divide by the total amount of milk. That's something like what we're talking about in terms of a pool value. So Leonard mentioned something earlier that's really kind of important, which is if I am buying milk to put it into a carton that goes to the grocery store, and I'm selling in one of these federal marketing areas, I absolutely am mandated to be regulated. I must pay that minimum price. There's no escaping. If I'm a cheese manufacturer, I can be regulated if I want to, but I don't have to be. And the incentive that I have to be regulated is that I get a part of that pool of dollars that I can use to pay my producers. So when I'm talking about milk that's currently being pooled, I'm talking about milk that is actually currently a part of that value pool of dollars, which in the upper Midwest is about 75% of the farm milk in Minnesota and Wisconsin. But that means 25% of the milk is actually not part of that pool of dollars, and we don't really know, we don't have a good handle on what that pricing looks like. But recently I called on the dairy farmer that maybe actually trying to do a little noodling, some number crunching on some stuff, where we're looking at the all milk price, excuse me, for the state of Wisconsin. And then if you look at the value of class 3 components, I showed you a value of like about $25 or $26 in a recent month. Well, the all milk price in the state of Wisconsin in August was $23. So the value of people who are pooling their milk components is about $25. And the people who are getting 24 out of the pool have to get less than $23. And actually at average during 2024, really less than what that state all milk price would be. So there's a considerable reduction in the value that farmers would be paid for the milk if they're not currently in the pool, based on the best way we can move those numbers. So when I said there might be a negative 92-cent decrease in the component values, I'm already $1.50 down. I'm not going down another 92 cents. Right, so I might not see any impact on my pay price relative to that. But the price of milk that's actually in the pool is going to be reduced by those component values, at least in the short term. Does that make sense? Yeah.
You kind of talked about this, that the farm bill could mandate a producer or processor survey for make allowances. If that came back as a difference, what would be the process that USDA would have to go through to change the make allowance? Would they just change it just through administrative decree, or would they have to go back through the order process again?
Okay, so the question, if you didn't hear from that room, is if a survey were mandated by USDA, what would that process look like? And would they have to go back through This extraordinary long, costly, and painful process of having a hearing with hundreds of hours of testimony and thousands of pages of documents submitted. I think the model for that would be actually how things were done in the state of California before they had a government marketing order. And they actually had an annual survey, mandated survey of the processing facilities in that state. They collected information and they had a relatively streamlined process by which they would decide, based on that distribution of values that I showed you, what the make allowance should be for the coming year. So every year, they actually updated that on the basis of a mandated survey of all the plants. They didn't have to go through this extraordinarily painful process to do it. Interestingly, we had a workshop in September in Madison in which a dairy farmer, Ben from California, part of the Milk Producers Council out there, was part of our panel for the industry. And he actually didn't like that system because it allowed for too quick an adjustment in the make allowances over time, even if it was being based on information from the plants. So you can maybe spin that in a couple of different ways, in the sense that maybe you do it every year, maybe you do it every 3 years, but you don't wait 15.
How often do they adjust theirs?
The California adjustment, they don't do it anymore because now they're in a federal marketing order. And so they don't have the mandated surveys anymore, and they don't adjust the make allowances. They're in the same situation as everybody else. Yeah, question over here.
So. Because California don't have any federal market order anymore.
No, they do have a federal marketing order before, they don't have their own state regulated pricing that they use.
Oh.
So cut out the question. Okay.
If I understood you correctly, in order to change how the orders are dealt with, because you said that the USDA couldn't mandate survey. We have to go back and change the original 1937 law that governs all of this exists within that space.
Yeah, so we currently are kind of operating under a series of amendments to that law. And in fact, Congress can and has weighed in and said we would like to do some things differently. They did this, the last time we made a major change to federal marketing orders that came online in the year 2000. And Congress basically weighed in and said, we don't like what the USDA said in terms of how the pricing should be set, do it this way. They all similarly weighed in the 2018 Farm Bill, where we went from the higher of the class 3, class 4 price to the average of. And presumably, well, USDA is recommending taking that back and taking it back to where we're performing. But they would in principle have the ability to amend the legislation through the Farm Bill, basically say, you will do these mandated surveys in the pricing.
What happens if milk production doesn't go down? And in a couple of your last slides, you assume that milk production would drop. What if it doesn't, and does it matter if it drops nationally or by federal order 30? Because nationally we have some pretty large dairies coming on, unfortunately.
Yeah. So basically the question is, if we don't see the kind of milk supply response that we assumed in our economic analysis, what will be the implications of that? Maybe that's the way that I'll think about it. So if we don't see as much of a milk production response nationally, which could be kind of responding to those lower component pay prices, we're going to have more milk around and more components, and that means that the price impacts would be more than what I showed you there. Prices would be lower for a longer period. But I think another important part of your question was we do have actually regional supply and demand balance issues for milk that relate to farmer production decisions, but also kind of the capacity of plants to be able to do something with that. Particularly here in the case of cheese. So we don't currently have the ability to sort of think about exactly how this might play out differently in different parts of the world. Actually, for different farms, they're going to make different decisions on the basis of what they see in terms of those incentives or component values. So the likely effect, though, is if we don't have that response on the milk side, we actually will still see kind of an increased demand for milk at those lower values, be made in cheese and other products. Probably that would actually help us with some expansion of export markets. Well, that kind of raises one other thing that I maybe mentioned, or maybe I should mention it. Other countries are looking fairly closely at what we're planning to do here because they're concerned that we're going to be doing some kind of, sneaky export subsidy by lowering the values of farm milk and making product prices lower. So we had in our September workshop, we're quite concerned about what we do in terms of trade systems with it. Hitting each other with pillows about very trade issues between the two countries. We also had folks from Europe. And New Zealand and Australia kind of wondering about whether or not they even want the future export growth in the United States. So it's kind of a broader issue. It's a little bit to your question of what exactly are those prices. Yeah, the question.
Just in relation to the, what we just said, so basically without doing any subsidy or other thing, we are lowering our meat price in the market, that can also be, a good head start in the export or, export market.
Yes, that's the fundamental logic of that is kind of what you described. But if we know with make allowances, we allow more milk to be made, cheese, for example. We expect more cheese inventories to be available for purchase. We expect that dampening effect on cheese prices, which also is part of it, how this speaks back to the farm milk price. Because as I mentioned, we set the farm milk price on the basis of the product. So for U.S. farmers, it's going to be an important issue. And it's also something that our export market competitors are going to be looking at.
So certainly that is not dumping, right? Because that came from the main market, right?
Yeah, well, so the question is really about whether this constitutes what we would call dumping, and not just often have our time describing exactly what that really is. I would just say it could provide an additional incentive for higher levels of exports from the US.
So outside of Federal Order 30 in California, the proposed plan is a plus for everybody, right? Dollar level.
Yeah, so we haven't been able to look in great detail order by order because the tools we have don't allow us to do that. So you can do what USDA did, which is to do a backward-looking view of the values of the pools over time. When they did that, and I think it roughly corresponds to what we might see in the future, Order 30 here in the upper Midwest, Order 51 in California, but also the Arizona order, would have seen decreased overall values because of the amount of manufacturing milk that they have relative to that offsetting effect of having higher phosphate differentials. I think that would be broadly the kind of pattern that we would expect to play out regionally. I don't have any doubt that dairy producers in Florida are going to find lovely idea. Raise their phosphate differentials, make allowance doesn't really have that big impact on it. Political buyers, the farmers probably not have an issue with that because the net is an increase in pay price. Okay. Let's look at kind of where the rubber meets the road, and we want to try and see what we're thinking. This is a choice that Leonard had talked about, which is you can either keep the order with these changes, and it has some potential benefits to doing that, or you can say, we think we're better off without the order. So we'll talk in a minute about how a vote on that by farmers and dairy farmers in Florida. And I think there's any thoughts from folks in the room or I mean, this essentially is the choice. I think this is the choice that the dairy farmers will be facing, dairy farmers in Florida. A flashback, I think maybe to the previous of the slide for this question. Yeah, I think that's additional thought on what we're really talking about here. We have a heavy representation from Wisconsin Farm Bureau Federation. I'm not trying to pick on this organization. Do you have kind of thoughts on either kind of more personal expressions of how you're thinking about this, organizational expressions, or other organizations that you heard talk about this particular decision and would feel comfortable sharing them?
The co-op will still be modified.
Okay, why don't we talk about that in a minute? Because the co-ops are looking at that. I guess I would argue, this, even if you're a co-op member and your co-op is block voting, presumably there's some process by which they decide what that block vote will be. It might be that it's not a big, long discussion, and it might be that they pretty much know what they're gonna do. What my understanding is they actually have to provide some certification to USDA that says, our board considered this and we reached a resolution, and resolution was that you're block voting yourself. So to me, that means that there's still a role for co-op members to play in the discussions with the co-op. And of course, if you are not a co-op, you have the right to vote however you wish and receive an individual ballot from USDA to cast the vote. So why don't we go ahead and we'll kind of go back, we'll leave that as a thought question. So I teach classes at UW Madison, and sometimes you kind of go, get a super good answer to that, but at least how you can think about it. I think one of the things that we, as folks that work in the kind of research and educational programming area, is there information that would be helpful to have for you, for your members, for your individual organization that you want to share with us? And chat. Okay, well, you can think about that too. We're always available with suggestions. Resulted in the series of meetings that we're having today was to sort of provide some educational opportunities to folks that understand this issue.
We'll have a little more time too at the end to revisit some of those questions as well. So this kind of gets to the question of co-op block voting. What does voting mean? What does that mean in this referendum process? So when the USDA does announce their final decision, again, we're looking at mid-November for that. It will specify the details of the voting process, which includes the representative month that counts for eligibility and the time of the voting. So the date requirements for ballots to be postmarked and received by USDA. Typically, we've seen in the past, this is a 30 to 45 day time frame. So when we take a look at eligibility, so who's eligible to vote in this process? When we look at producers, you have to have delivered milk to a handler that is regulated by the federal milk marketing orders, geographic area, and that representative month, which USDA will specify when their final ruling comes out. So you have to be actively engaged in producing grade A milk at the time of the referendum. On the cooperative side, they have to represent producers who are actively producing and marketing grade A milk within an order in that stated month. So actively marketing milk means processing or selling in that order. And they have to be recognized by USDA. So again, block voting by cooperatives. So because cooperatives are considered producers under federal milk marketing orders, they are allowed to block vote on behalf of their members. The co-op must provide USDA with certification of the resolution authorizing the vote at the time ballots are submitted. If the cooperative does not block vote, its members may cast individual ballots. Go ahead.
So if I disagree with how my co-op is going to vote, can I request an individual ballot from my co-op?
You would not request an individual ballot from the co-op, you would request an individual ballot from the order. From your order administrator.
I guess I could say you can always ask the co-op, whether or not they're gonna give you one is kind of up to them.
Right, but you can't, but the producer could get one if he disagreed with however the co-op was going to vote.
Yeah. Okay. So the legislation that acted, that I talked about earlier, basically says co-ops may block vote. So that gives them the authority to vote on behalf of all of their members. And so if they say, we're voting, and this is what the vote is, they have the right to do that under the federal market order system. So I think you're talking about a little bit more of an internal cooperative. Basically, it's kind of hard for the co-op to say we're going to block vote, but we're going to let some members vote in a different way. So the legislation basically says you either block vote. Okay. So whether there's any leeway within the cooperative itself is a little bit of an open question, but I'm guessing that there will be.
So what does the voting threshold look like? So to amend an order with the provisions of the final decision. First is what's looked at is 2/3 of the voting producers must approve. Or 2/3 of the milk volume represented by voting producers must approve. So under block voting, cooperatives may cast a unanimous ballot for all membership who are eligible, which constitutes towards 2/3 of the voting producers or that milk volume. So important point at the bottom, USDA will first count producers, then milk volume if needed. Questions on that?
Can I make one other comment? So this is 2/3 of the voting members, not 2/3 of the eligible vote. 2/3 of people who voted, not 2/3 of people who are eligible. Okay, so you actually have to vote for your vote to count. It's a little bit like other elections.
So again, key elements of USDA's recommended decision, again, changing that standard milk composition, removing cheese barrels, increase in make allowance here, revert to the higher of class 3 or class 4 skim milk price, the provision to adjust class 1 price for ESL milk, and increasing those class 1 differentials. As we go kind of through the educational process here throughout the week, we'll kind of dive into each one of these topics more individually. So if there's specific questions on those, we're happy to address them today, but do encourage you to, log in, jump on Zoom for those that are happening later this week as well. I'll let Chuck kind of go through some of the impacts of the recommended decision.
So this is where I'm going to actually just give a quick summary. I'm getting close to the end here, but a couple of things that I want to remind folks about from this are, Leonard just showed you a slide that says there are multiple different elements that would be changed by the recommended decision, assuming it's carried over to the final decision. So the changes and the effect on dairy farm pay prices in particular are going to depend on all of those different changes simultaneously. We've highlighted today the impacts of make allowances because particularly in this part of the world, that's actually one of the impacts likely to be larger and more important for that value of farm milk. So we've also tried to consider them a little bit separately to kind of make sure that we understand the different elements of the decision. We also know that the impacts of this are going to vary by order. So in an order like order 30, where we have 90+% of our milk going to the cheese, that implies some things about the component values for class 3 that are not going to be applicable, as I mentioned, for folks that are in the Florida order, where more than 80% of the milk is in class 1 and beverage milk. Okay. So I also noted there some orders priced on the basis of components. So you paid on the components in your milk. We talked about the potential decreases in component values as a result of the formulas. We also have orders that are priced in a little bit different way, and they'll be affected slightly differently. We probably don't need to go into that for this particular audience. The skim butter fat orders have a little bit different set of issues. And finally, I want to reiterate that this is actually a decision that's not just kind of about what happened or what happened in the last 5 years, but is like what is likely to happen in the coming 5 years as we see the evolution of supply, demand, and prices in response to the changes that USDA expected. Okay. So I want to show you now kind of a couple of graphs that provide again the price dynamics over the next 4 or 5 years that we would likely see based on our economic modeling work. And in addition to what I showed you before, I want to show you nationwide, we would expect actually for there to be an increase in those class 1 prices because of the increase in the class 1 differentials that we'll talk about coming up at the next bar meetings here. We'd also see some changes in class 2 that mirror the kinds of changes that we will see in class 4 that I showed you earlier. And then we also have the all milk price for the United States here, recognizing that that varies quite a lot from region to region. But you can see actually, as we look at the trajectories over time, there's some negative impacts that we expect for early on in the all milk price, some positive impacts later on in the couple of last 2 years that are shown there. And overall, kind of a smaller negative impact on the all milk price for the country as a whole. So one way to look at this is that USDA did months of testimony, thousands of hours, thousands of pages, and they actually came up with something that over the next 5 years for the nation as a whole is not really going to have that large an impact on the all milk price. Again, recognizing there can be some very important regional differences. And then if we go back and contrast that a little bit by looking at class 3 and class 4 prices and the components, which you see kind of a different story being told there, where the regions that are much more heavily invested in class 3 and class 4 milk are going to be much more negatively affected by the changes in those component values, even if it gets a little bit better after 2 to 3 years. Okay. So these are kind of different perspectives on what the overall impacts we'd expect from this decision to be. And it highlights the fact that there will be different impacts in different orders in different parts of the country. Okay. So I also want to make folks aware, if they're not already aware, that we have a website called dairymarkets.org that provides information on a variety of different topics as well as dairy industry data. It's operated by our DMAP, Dairy Markets and Policy Program. It's out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as Cornell University. We have done a series of 6 what we call information letters that are usually 2 to 4 page summaries of some of the issues that we talked about today. So if anyone needs some additional resources, we have some written resources that are available for I'm happy to have you check those things out. Okay. So I think we'll turn it over to Q&A, but if folks are wanting to follow up with us today, there's the emails for both of us there. We can respond to you as much as you like. So we're going to ask for additional questions based on kind of getting the end off of that. Everyone.
Just want to go one more slide forward.
Oh, sorry. Actually, why don't we do this? See if we have some Q&A and we can do evaluation something. So other questions? Either online or in folks in the room?
Can you go back and number 5?
Sure. How far back do you want to do it?
I think it's 2. That one, yep.
Okay.
So if you're looking at these, and I'm a dairy farmer, and I'm looking at these 2 graphs, what can I gather from what USDA was trying to think about when they look into the different accounts of the dog marketing orders and changes they proposed? If you look at the changes that they had here, what can I gather from what they were trying to accomplish?
Okay, so the question you couldn't hear it was, if you look at the slide up there that has these 2 graphs, can you think a little bit about what USDA was trying to accomplish? So, we started out with a little bit of a conversation about why do we have these things called political marketing orders in the first place? And they are primarily, not quite exclusively, but primarily designed to ensure that we have an adequate supply of milk that goes into beverages. And so they focus quite a lot on what is going on with class one milk. And they require that class one milk buyers to be regulated. But as we said earlier, they don't require the other classes of people who are buying milk in their classes to be regulated, but they need to be regulated. So one of the ways to view what USDA is doing is to kind of say that they had a fairly narrow set of guardrails that they were working with them, right? So they took testimony on a lot of different topics. Key among them were two, one, the bank allowances that we talked about, and the other was the class one differential. And they had some pretty reasonable evidence that was presented to them that said, we really think you should make some changes to both those things. So they have evidence that said it costs more now to make cheese than it used to, so we should probably adjust that. And we have evidence that suggests that it's more costly to move milk around and put it into a bottling plant and get it distributed to customers than use the date. Right? So, I mean, I don't want to get into the mind of the USDA too much, but the way that I view what they were doing was they said, well, our job is to see whether or not these formulas are have the right values in them, at least for the purposes of this hearing. We've determined that the formulas don't have what we think are the right values to the evidence. So we're going to change the formulas. And for them, I think they do that being consistent with the objective is to work within their existing system to find the right price values for farm milk based on the way the system currently works. So if you look at something like this, and I think another part of the logic, at least at an action level, is okay, if we're going to give something on the make allowance side and those component values, we actually have the opportunity to sort of give something back in terms of what's going on with that higher class one differential across. So there's a little bit of a balancing. That's actually why I said kind of at the end of the day, the all milk pricing kind of gets back to some place that might have been kind of where it was anyway, but with some very significant regional differences. And USDA can't sort of say, well, we shouldn't prejudice this against order 30. They have to sort of think about how the entire system is structured. They look at the evidence, they say, seems like we need to increase the bank allowances. They look at the evidence, they say, seems like we need to increase the class one differentials. So they do. And then they have to sort of deal with the fact that the implications of that are going to be very different in different parts of the country. I do want to point out, though, that even though I think they recognize that, in fact, their numbers show California, Upper Midwest, Arizona are in the red as a result of this, looking back the past 5 years. I think they are genuinely trying to move across the entire system when they do that. We also get to the point where we say, okay, we don't like it. We don't like it as kick in the pants for lower employment values. On the other hand, it's got the choice between low and lower in terms of the value of the loan that we're likely to see. And by the way, we pointed out the orders do have some other beneficial functions to dairy farmers and dairy processors that might be worth keeping around. But I think that's kind of where the mindset came out is they're kind of going, our job is to use these rules. And when it's appropriate, we found that the rules aren't kind of correctly structured. So we're going to change the rules. And they, it's not like they're not aware of the implications of this. But they're not supposed to base their decision only on the implications, but the evidence. That makes sense.
Yeah.
are they encouraging, a movement of milk? By that, do you anticipate, Wisconsin for a long time, and Western Wisconsin led the country in farm bankruptcy for a long time. And it hasn't been the case lately, but they've always been in that upper echelon. With this recommendation, we've heard, about the possibility of large farms moving to Nebraska, or not moving, but being created in Nebraska, other parts of central states. So with these recommendations, is the movement of milk being encouraged to other regions of the country?
Yeah, so the question is whether or not if you see these kinds of differential impacts on pay prices by different regions, specifically orders, is that going to provide some incentives for establishing milk production in different locations than it currently is? I guess maybe you can give me some of your impressions on this, but I look at this and I say 60 cents a hundredweight, is that enough for me to think about moving to Nebraska? Maybe. A pretty big investment. Is 40 cents enough? It's going to be less. And is 20 cents enough? That makes me think a little bit harder to scratch my head. Is there something else that's really good about it? So I think I just like talking about stuff that's being incentive. So could this make a few people do this? Yeah, absolutely. I think pretty big on the way. Is it likely to result in some kind of wholesale movement of milk out of the state of Wisconsin? Probably not being enough incentive. So again, this is also only for the milk that is currently being pooled. So 25% of the milk is probably not going to see this impact in any case because it's already sort of seen the impact of not being pooled. So I could say probably a little bit of incentive, but probably not big enough incentive to see some major shift in produce milk in the United States. If you think about the biggest areas that will see an increase in the pay prices down in the southeast, and kind of corridor away from North Carolina down in Mississippi. Basically, I'm not sure anybody's going to want to say, yeah, I think I'm moving Mississippi to dairy now because I got that higher cost on differential there. I think they're still going to struggle to kind of maintain a milk supply even with that higher values. It's more about making sure that the milk gets into plants than it is about really providing big incentives for additional production down there. Yeah, right.
So back to the one on the right side, back to my earlier question, reducing production. I mean, if that's only 10 cents there, I don't see that being enough to reduce production enough to make truly a difference.
Yeah, so the question is about the size of the reduction that we might expect in the pay price and what supply response we see from that. So, Brad, you're looking at the 10 cents, you're looking at the blue bar up there, like in 2024.
Take your choice of any of them, I guess, because they're all, depending upon when you look, you're looking at about a 10-cent difference one way or the other.
Yeah, so the blue bar there and the orange bar are actually showing kind of the prices that USDA is going to report. So our plastic price this month is going to be this, it'll be like 8 cents less than it would have been. What producers in Wisconsin are going to pay is not that blue. They're going to see the component value play out in terms of the gray bar. So I guess you can let me know if you get 60 cents is enough or something different. Doing something different.
Okay, I guess now we're to the point of my question.
Yeah.
But 60 cents, if production goes down, I'm still going to lose 50 cents in 2026. And that's assuming that production has gone down.
So these are annual price adjustments that we're calculating on the basis of some monthly analysis. So the values can be different. Initially, they'll probably ride up and down in the back of the 3-year price cycle in addition to that. So yes, it's saying it's going to take a while for that additional demand for cheese milk to happen and the production response. It's part of dairy farmers. And again, this is a bit of a kind of a blurry picture because we're looking at trying to do like all the dairy farmers in the United States. Right? So I'm not standing up here saying, well, that's exactly what's going to happen. What I'm saying is we're likely to see some bigger impacts in first years on the commodity values. And then as we see some adjustment on those supply side and on the demand side, we're likely to see some improvement. So I showed you in a previous graph a monthly value for 92 cents, not 60 cents. So we're already seeing like some, a little bit of an offset takes place. I mean, I've never owned a dairy farm. I'm not sure what I would do under the kind of circumstances, but I do know go to meetings and talk with farmers, and they'll say, well, no, you don't have it from the no, nothing. Make more milk. Yeah. I go, yeah, okay, sure, I understand that, but ultimately, if that was the case, do they more milk, price go down? No, they pay more milk, price go down, and that hasn't been what we see happening. So at some point, somebody said, yeah, that doesn't make sense. So could there be some significant delays while people work on the for years? Sure. Vary a lot by farm to farm. This is kind of trying to give us an aggregated pattern that suggests it's not 60 cents, maybe it's 50 cents, maybe it's $1 in the first year, but it should be better going forward. And as you're suggesting, we don't see much adjustment. 10 cents is not enough to notice. Small in the scheme of it. 60 cents, about 180, we're starting to get people attention. Okay, we're happy to take other questions, kind of after the fact in the emails, maybe put those back up there. And I think Leonard, you want to do kind of a post, wrap up and evaluation, so let me hand it over to you.
So before everyone runs, if you just take your phones out one more time here, just a quick 3 questions for you. So that way we can kind of use your information and insight to improve our next presentations as well. Any additional questions, comments? Things you'd like addressed?
Do you know, in Federal Order 30, how many, um, how many co-ops there are? And then I'm trying to think about it as like a campaign now, how many co-ops need to vote in the positive to have it pass? Like, you know, if you think about it as like a campaign ad, we need to get 270, you know, like how many co-ops need to get, which one need to go in the positive to get the positive. Because,
I don't have the number. I did look that up, like 2 weeks ago, and it is on the federal order website. You can see a list of all of the eligible co-ops, or all of the co-ops in which will be reviewed for eligibility for voting. Right? So I know that's on there. I don't have the numbers, so.
I mean, that's actually a really great question. I don't know the specific, like, going out for that either. If you ask me what I thought was likely to happen, I would be, I'd tell you, I think we're gonna keep over to.
Very unscientific assessment, that's it.
Part of that would be volume of milk as well, right? So when you look at who's voting, there's obviously gonna be some heavy hitters within that list.
Actually, maybe one additional data point, I mentioned about 75% of the adult people in Minnesota, Wisconsin, is school one over 30, most of them are at school. So last time I checked, 75% was here, 2/3, and so if that's an indication, then that's an indication.
We'll be around. We can leave the chat open as well if folks want, but, I think we're having us appreciate it. We'll be around for further questions as well.